Okay, welcome back. We're going to do chapters 7 and 8 on this one. Those two chapters are a little bit shorter, so we're going to combine the two into one video. Um, Chapter 7 has to do with hot holding and the actual service of the food. So the food has already been cooked, and now you are getting ready to actually plate it and serve it. So the objectives here are describe the parameters for hot holding, cold holding, how to use time temperature controls, and then preventing contamination in a self-service area such as buffets when serving food to customers. So if you are in a public establishment where there's such as like a buffet type setup, there's going to have to be some sort of a sneeze guard. So the sneeze guard is like the glass that goes above the food service areas. So if you've ever been to like a Golden Corral or something like that, how they have glass that goes all the way around. So basically that is just kind of a physical barrier that they put up to try to minimize how much people will, with their face reach over the area and of course prevent um, any sort of like droplets that may come out of a person's mouth from talking or sneezing. Um, and then, like I said, it kind of keeps people back a little bit rather than hovering over food, which helps prevent some contamination. Um, Also, it mentions in the book serving utensils. So in an environment like that, you're going to have one serving utensil dedicated to each item. You cannot use the same utensil across items. That would open up, the potential for cross contamination between items. So hot holding is when you are actually you have the food, it's already made. You are waiting to serve it. So this food is past the cooking process. You're just holding it at temp in order to serve it safely. So they give you some requirements on that. To hold TCS food at the correct temperature, hot food has to be 135 or higher. So an example there is like soup in a well. So we call these like a hot well or a steam well. Um, there is hot water underneath that pot, which generates steam and it keeps everything that's on the line hot. Um, and then you would be responsible for taking the temperature of those items at least every 4 hours. So the book mentions, that it might be best practice to measure the temperature every couple hours because then that allows you room for corrective action. So kind of the more often that you're checking, the sooner you can catch it. In the event that it is off temp, you would have to take it out of that service well, heat it in a pot again, back up to temperature, and then you would have to put it back into the service well. Um, don't use the service wells for actually heating food. It's not safe. They just don't heat quickly enough. Um, like for instance, if you have some pre-made soups, or maybe you have a soup that's left over from yesterday, it's still safe to serve, but you just need to heat it up, right? So I have seen one time. He never did it again. But did see a chef pour the soup into a well like this, um, and then no, I don't know if it was soup or a sauce or something, but he just used it to heat the food. He was caught by a manager, and then he never did that again. But it is a bad habit that sometimes people fall into. It's not safe, especially if you're not temping it and making sure that it's actually getting up to the proper temperature, for leftovers, it needs to get up to 165. So, if your hot well is set at 135 to 140, which is what typically they're set at, then it's not going to get up to 165. All right, what else? So, cold foods. So cold foods that are out on buffet, if they are not, if they don't have any ice or refrigeration to keep them cold, you're going to have to take internal temperatures of those items also. So, examples of that would be like outside catering jobs or something like that. You wouldn't want the potato salad sitting out for 8 hours, without any temperature control. So again, to reiterate, never use hot holding equipment to reheat food. Reheat food correctly and then move it into the holding unit. Cold food can be held without temperature control for up to 6 hours if the following applies. It was held under refrigeration, so given that everything was done correctly so far, and then it does not exceed 70 degrees during service. They are giving you sort of a window. They don't want it to get into that most dangerous zone, right? So once it gets from like 70 to 125, that's the area where bacteria is going to grow the fastest. So they don't want you to exceed that temperature. So for instance, you have a catering event and it's for the 4th of July. We're in Texas. It's 150 degrees outside, and you are serving coleslaw, right? Or egg salad. Let's say egg salad. It's been sitting out, for only 3 hours, but the internal temp is reading 85 degrees. That is a dangerous situation, even though it has only been out for a couple hours, because just the climate that it's in is just too hot. It's not conducive to safe food. So that's the reason why, they want you to also be mindful of how hot something's getting if it is staying out of refrigeration. You need to label your food. Don't ever put a food in a refrigerator or out for service without a label on it. Everything has to be labeled. As a chef, this is the rest of your life. Just label absolutely everything, even if you think it's only going to be in there for a little bit. The health inspector is going to look for labels every time that they come. So anything that's not labeled is going to be an issue for you. So it's best to just get in the habit of things just are not allowed in the refrigerator unless they have a label on them. So you would have a label so this would be an example, it would be like for a catering event. So this is something that's not necessarily going into storage, but you would have to label when it was removed from refrigeration and then when it must be thrown out. So this helps the service staff to be aware and keep track of the food. It is sold, served, or thrown out within 6 hours. So anything that is left, that is cold, that is left out without refrigeration, you have 6 hours to serve that or get rid of it. So those hours are different for hot holding. So if you have a hot food that can be held without temperature control for up to 4 hours, so that means there's no heat well, there's no oven, there's nothing keeping it hot. Once you remove it from the temperature control, you have 4 hours to get that item served. So an example of this would be like kolaches. So if you ever go to a kolache shop and you notice that there's a lot of like breakfast sandwiches, and they might have egg, bacon, sausage, or something inside of a croissant, and they heat it up for you but they pull it off of a tray that is being held at room temperature. So why are they allowed to do that? They're allowed to do that because they have to be sold, served, or thrown out within 4 hours. So it's not being monitored according to temperature controls, because they wouldn't necessarily want a cold sandwich. But as long as those sandwiches are sold within 4 hours, they are within their parameters and those sandwiches are safe. So to prevent contamination when serving food, we already know that if it is a ready-to-eat food or it's a food that's not going to be cooked anymore, that we use gloves. Also, you could use something else to pick up the food. So in the event that you didn't have gloves nearby, you could use tongs, spatulas, deli sheets, something to where it's not hand-on food contact. Use clean and sanitized utensils for serving. So use clean utensils for each food. Clean and sanitize utensils after each task, and at minimum, clean and sanitize them at least once every 4 hours. So you may notice that during service that a worker behind a buffet just kind of resets all of the utensils. That is a requirement. So if you're working an 8-hour shift, you would have to do it at least once. So you would put out clean utensils when you open, and then 4 hours later, you would have to switch them out for new clean utensils. Prevent contamination when serving food. So store serving utensils correctly between uses. So the health department likes to see all of the handles facing the same way, so that when you grab, you make sure that you're only grabbing the handle side and not the food contact side. So when you have your serving utensils being stored, they should be on a clean and sanitized food contact surface. You wouldn't want to put them on a dirty surface, right? And then you're going to transfer that bacteria just from surface contact. Or if it's in the food with the handle extended above the container rim. So you wouldn't want it to be down inside the food. Another popular violation with the health department is ingredient bins. So in our bakery, we have sugar flour bins. So they're filled with just dry product. The scoops, there is a scoop hanger where it's inside, it's integrated into the bucket, it's part of the bucket. So in between uses, you would hang the scoop back on the top of the bucket. Sometimes students will use a container to scoop up the ingredient and then leave the container inside of the bucket. That is not allowed. You cannot do that. You can't leave any containers or handles or spoons or anything like that inside the product. It always has to be above the product. So like in this situation, it's a serving so that you're not digging down into the product. But also if you're just using raw products like sugar or flour, also you can't have any type of a utensil in the product. Okay, so we have some examples here of proper handling for dishes and glassware. So in the first picture, the man is carrying a glass rack. So this is how you put glasses through the dishwasher. So he's just carrying the whole glass rack. His coworker here has stacked up all the glasses, and she's kind of using her body to balance all of them. This would be incorrect because she's touching all over the rims of the glasses, and she's also putting them onto her clothing. On number 2, we're looking at the hand placement of where the thumb is. You want to avoid touching the surface of the plate when you are serving. So this comes in play when you are serving and teaching your wait staff proper service etiquette. Also, people just don't really like to see that. People don't like to see someone's thumb in the middle of their plate. The next one is for placing silverware. So they are placing forks. So the first one's doing it properly. He's grabbing the fork by the handle and placing it down. The other is just kind of grabbing the area where you would actually put the fork in your mouth. So the tines of the fork. That would obviously be incorrect. So in the next one, he is serving a bagel to someone. So he's using tongs, which would be appropriate. So this could also go for a customer. So like if a customer is a self-serving themselves a bagel, you would want to make sure that they have tongs to grab their product rather than using their hands. Make sure that these things are available. The general public is not going to go out of their way to try to find tongs, but they will generally use them if they're available and they see them, right? So you want to make sure that people are set up to follow the rules. And the next one is ice. This is a big safety hazard. Anytime you've got glass, there's a chance that the glass can chip or crack. So I would also say don't fill glasses over the ice. But in the first picture, they're showing you that they're using an ice scoop, which is appropriate. You would want to scoop ice into glasses rather than what the person in the bottom is doing, where they're actually using their hand to scoop the ice into the glass. But also don't use the actual glass as a scoop. They can break very easily, and then you end up having to burn out the whole ice well, and it's very time consuming. If you use preset tableware, prevent it from being contaminated by wrapping it. Usually this is why you see the silverware wrapped up in napkins or in some sort of like a paper sleeve. Sometimes they use. Sometimes they also need to wrap them in a paper napkin. Table settings do not need to be wrapped or covered. If extra settings are removed when guests are seated, are cleaned and sanitized after guests have left. So sometimes you'll see that where it may be their protocol to have a silverware set up at each area. However, they may take away the unnecessary silverware whenever your party's seated. So in that case, there really hasn't been any guest contact there. Some jurisdictions allow the refilling of take-home containers. So these would be like the thicker plastic deli containers. They would not be the thinner ones, and they're generally labeled not for reuse if you should not clean and sanitize them. So the thinking is basically that if the container is rigid enough to be cleaned and sanitized without compromising the material, then it can be reused. So an example of this would be like a Starbucks cup or something like that, where if you bring in your cup, they will fill it with coffee as long as it's clean, or they can offer to clean it for you. So in that case, it is okay to use reusables. However, I would say it's not too common. Sometimes like gas stations offer reduced cost refills on soda beverages. If you buy their thermos mug or something like that, that would be another example of that. So same thing with beverage containers. These can be refilled for the same customer. The container must be able to be effectively cleaned at home and at the operation, rinsed with fresh pressurized hot water before refilling, and refilled using a process that prevents contamination. So never reserve foods that have ever been placed onto a table. You would never want to be served this way. So, don't ever try to cut corners with your guests. So food that was returned by one customer, don't serve it to another, right? So if a customer says, oh, this isn't what I ordered, send it back. The general rule is once food has touched a table, that's it. That food is no longer able to be used. Um, Never reserve uncovered condiments, uneaten bread, or plate garnishes. Um, okay. Prevent time and temperature abuse and contamination with your sneeze guards. So they do give you exact measurements. So they have to be located 14 inches above the counter and must extend 7 inches beyond the food. So if they were too small, you would have an issue with that. So generally, it's not an issue if they're too big. They're probably almost never too big, but they do have to meet this minimum criteria. Identify all your food items, so label the food so that whenever people are able to serve themselves, they know exactly what they are getting. This also helps with people with allergies. Place salad dressing names on ladle handles, so that way there's no confusion, and it also cuts down on how many times people go through and dip it up and look at it and try to figure out what it is. Um, so in your self-service areas, prevent your time, temperature abuse, and contamination. Keep your hot food at 135 degrees or higher. Cold food is at 41 degrees or lower. Keep raw meat, fish, and poultry separate from ready-to-eat food. So this is stuff that you know already. Do not let customers refill dirty plates or use dirty utensils at self-service areas. So you may notice if you've ever been to a buffet, it always says bring a clean plate with you for your next trip to the buffet. This is the reason why. Because what can happen is, after a person eats off of a plate, and then they go back for more, there can be a tendency to, maybe the ladle touches the plate, and there can be some cross-contamination of, germs or also just other items that may have been on their plate. So if someone had a peanut sauce and then they go and get some broccoli, then the ladle touches it, and then they've kind of infected the broccoli with peanut, and that could be an issue for someone that has an allergy. But also just for basic sanitation, you wouldn't want to be sharing germs with other people. So preventing time, temperature abuse, and contamination. Stock food displays with the correct utensils for dispensing the food. So make sure that the utensil that you choose is actually appropriate for what the item is. And then also, again, they mention do not use ice as an ingredient if it was used to keep food or beverages cold. So if you have, used the ice to keep your shrimp cold in the cooler, you would not want to put that in someone's beverage. Labeling bulk food in self-service areas. When labeling bulk food in self-service areas, make sure the label is in plain view of the customer. Include the manufacturer or processor label provided with the food. As an alternate, provide the information using a card, sign, or other labeling method. So this is like in the grocery store, in the kind of the section where you can self-serve nuts and spices and items like that. A label is not needed for bulk unpackaged food such as from the bakery, like donuts or things like that. The product makes no claim regarding health or nutrient content. No laws requiring labeling exist. So that would be up to your local municipality. So whatever your county is telling you is required. A food is manufactured or prepared on the premises. The food is manufactured or prepared at another regulated food operation or processing plant owned by the same person. So these are commonly called hubs. A hub is where say all the cooking or all the baking happens in one area, in one main kitchen, and then they just send out finished product to different like outlets, right? So as an example, Papa's restaurants, they have a bakery hub. So in their bakery hub, they make all of the cakes and pies and dessert items for their restaurants. All of the food that is made in the restaurants is fresh and it does not come from a hub, but they do have all of their bakery items consolidated in one area. So they send out fresh pies and things to the different restaurants around town. So that's an example of what a hub is. Offsite service, so this would be catering. Use insulated food grade containers designed to stop food from mixing, leaking, or spilling. Clean the inside of delivery vehicles regularly. So that's kind of a big one. A lot of times, you know, there's a lot of cleaning involved in food service. So you need to make sure that things get cleaned up properly and all surfaces get cleaned. So if you're using a delivery van, then now you also have to clean the surfaces of your delivery van. So it's not just your ladles and plates and utensils and things like that anymore. It's it's also the metal lining of the the van. Make sure that all that stuff is clean too. You would also have to make sure that it is a sanitizable surface. It could not be a carpeted van because you can't clean and sanitize carpet. Label food with a use by date and time and reheating and service instructions. So when you're delivering food offsite, make sure that the service site has the correct utilities. So if there is no water for hand washing, you're going to have to bring it, provide it. You're also going to have to bring yourself a sanitation bucket. Garbage containers are going to have to be on site and available. They're going to have to be able to be stored away from the actual food and prep area because of the flies. Store raw meat, poultry, seafood, and ready-to-eat items separately. So you're still going to have to follow the same rules for an off-site catering job as you would for, food production procedures in any other place. Okay. All right, so moving on to chapter 8. So this chapter talks about management and also developing a HACCP plan. I did include in your weekly folder an example from a health department I found. It's a booklet of how to help restaurants develop a HACCP plan. So you don't necessarily need a HACCP plan for everything that you make, but certain items tend to be a little bit more dangerous. And if you choose to serve those items, then yes, you would have to actually have a HACCP plan. So examples would be sous vide cooking, where you would actually vacuum pack an item and then cook it under a low temperature. So it's the reduced oxygen packing that you would have to go through the whole process of how whatever you're making is going to go, and then you would have to identify the critical control points, so the points where you would have to manage that bacteria, and then how you would manage that. Would it be with refrigeration? Would you manage it with cooking to a certain temperature? or cooling how quickly, so basically the HACCP plan is a description of how you're going to manage those hazards. So the Food Safety Management System is a group of practices and procedures intended to prevent foodborne illness, and it actively controls risks and hazards throughout the flow of food. So these are kind of the foundations of the training. These are the major points. You need a personal hygiene program. So this includes your hand washing. This includes your standards for how you want people to dress, how they will, keep their hair covered, things like that. Food safety training program. That's like what we're doing right now here with ServSafe. And then, using approved vendors and suppliers. And then quality assurance. So that's, you're going to have to actually, test and make sure that things are being followed properly. Cleaning and sanitation program. So how often are you cleaning? Is there a checklist? How do we make sure that things were cleaned? Who's cleaning the hood vents? Who's cleaning the ice machine? Things like that. Your standard operating procedures, sometimes called SOPs. This is going to be, a written record so that there is no ambiguity about how we do things and in the operation. And then you need a facility design and equipment maintenance program. So if something breaks down, you need to have someone on call that will come out and help you fix your equipment. Pest control. So there are several different companies out there that will provide pest control for your establishment. You should be on a schedule. They should come out routinely as preventative, and then they should come out, whenever you call them if you're seeing activity, and they will come out and help you control it and give you tips on what else you need to do. Maybe there's a hole in the wall or a vent or something. We have to figure out how these pests are getting in. So active managerial control focuses on controlling the 5 most common risks for foodborne illness. So the first one being purchasing food from unsafe sources. So, we talked about earlier, buying cheap seafood out of the back of someone's car. You're going to be on the hook for that. So that's a major liability for your restaurant. You need to make sure that you buy things from approved suppliers. Failing to cook food adequately. So that's where all of these internal cooking temperatures come in. Holding food at incorrect temperatures. So food being stored off temperature is a common hazard. I don't know if any of you remember Marvin Zindler, but he used to be a character. He was a news guy, and he would give his reports on local restaurants that had violations. It was very, very common, for them to have food holding violations, and in that case, the health inspector will quarantine that food and it gets thrown away. So if your food has been held off temperature, then you're going to have to throw it away on site in front of them. Using contaminated equipment. So this can be equipment that either just was not cleaned and sanitized in between uses, or this could be equipment that maybe there's still chemical residue on it. It could just be dirty equipment. And then practicing poor personal hygiene. Waiters and cook staff, maybe they're not washing their hands properly. Maybe they are, they don't take their aprons off when they go to the restroom. They don't, they're using their phone, they're touching their beard or hair, face while they're cooking. All of these things can spread pathogens. There are many ways to achieve managerial control in the operation. Number one is going to be training. So it's always going to start with training. It's the manager's responsibility to make sure that everyone understands what the standard operating procedures are for your restaurant to make sure that everything is safe. And then the manager is going to have to actively supervise and make sure that people are actually following their training and following the standard operating procedures. And then if a HACCP plan is needed, they would have to make sure that that is being followed and developed properly. These are critical for the success of active managerial control, and they are monitoring critical activities in the operation. So that is like, say, cooking temperatures. If someone is cooking chicken breast, they're cooking maybe 200, grilling them for a banquet, and they're not taking a temperature on each one, then a manager walks by and says, oh, hey, wait, hold on. You took these off the grill, but they're only at 145. All of those chicken, they're going to have to get cooked more, right? So that is the corrective action, is cooking them more. Verifying that the actions taken control the risk factors. So you would have to ask them to tempt them again, right? So that's your control. The FDA provides recommendations for controlling common risk factors for foodborne illness. So that includes demonstrating either through a quiz, a test, or actually performing something on the job. Staff health controls, so that would be, excluding or restricting employees. Controlling hands as a vehicle of contamination, so washing your hands and making sure that you're not spreading pathogens that way. Time and temperature parameters for controlling pathogens, so making sure that people are actually throwing things away when they're supposed to. So you would also not want to overproduce, right? So if you know that you typically sell 20 breakfast sandwiches every day, you would want to make sure that people only produce, what is expected to sell. If someone is overproducing, maybe they make 40 of them, they're going to be real tempted to just leave them out until they are sold. And then that would be a violation of time temperature abuse, because you've left them out too long. And it's bad for your food costs because you're wasting food. And then consumer advisories. The consumer advisories are typically at the bottom of the menu. It lets people know that there is a risk to eating undercooked foods. So that can be, for example, eggs Benedict, or sunny side up eggs that are not fully cooked. The yolk is still runny. Also undercooked meat, like a steak that's cooked medium rare. There is some inherent risk in eating those foods, but as we all know, they are popular items. So they are still allowed to be served, but they do come with a consumer advisory, letting the customer know that there is a risk. So the HACCP is based on identifying significant biological, chemical, and physical hazards at specific points within the product's flow of an operation. So a critical control point would be, when the item moves along its path, when it arrives into the operation, when you're receiving it, it needs to go into refrigeration. That is a critical control point. So it can't sit out in the middle of the floor for 6 hours. When it is being cooked, or I'm sorry, when it's being maybe marinated or getting fabricated in some way to actually cook it, then is it kept on ice on your workstation? Whenever you actually get ready to cook it, you would have to make sure that the bacteria is eliminated by cooking it to the 165. That's another critical control point. So it's kind of identifying the hazards along the way. So you have to be familiar with the ServSafe material to make sure that you can identify those points. So once identified, hazards can be prevented, eliminated, or reduced to safe levels. To be effective, a HACCP system must be based on a written plan. So your plan does have to be in writing. Usually they're kept in binders. And if you are serving any of the foods that require a HACCP plan, a health inspector will ask to actually see that plan. It would be specific to the facility's menu. So not every facility is going to have the same HACCP plans. Also, not every organization is even going to need a HACCP plan, but it kind of depends on how work is accomplished. Like in Harris County, to use what they call pooled eggs, so eggs that were in a shell, you cracked them, and now they are in, say, just a container. Maybe you've got 30 eggs that have been cracked into a container. You're going to use them for omelets in the morning. Okay, so these are eggs that have all been pooled together, and then in the morning you're going to whip them together, season them, and make them into omelets. You would need a HACCP plan for those pooled eggs. Okay, you would also need a HACCP plan for sous vide cooking. So it's very particular items. You can get a list of items from your local health authority, Harris County or City of Houston. They will tell you what they want. So here, these are the steps. The 7 HACCP principles: conduct a hazard analysis, determine critical control points, establish your critical limits. So your critical limits would be your parameters on time or temperature, or cooking temperatures, things like that. Establish monitoring procedures. So how are you going to make sure that these critical limits are not breached? Identify corrective actions. So what would you do? So this can be temperature monitoring, things like that. Verify that the system works. So you would have to do a test, actually run through the system and make sure that other people understand it and can execute it the way that you intend. Establish procedures for record keeping and documentation. So here's an example of Principle 1, conduct a hazard analysis. Identify potential hazards in the food served by looking at how it is processed. Identify TCS food items and determine where hazards are likely to occur. For each one, look for biological, chemical, and physical contaminants. So like for salads and cold sandwiches, prepare and then we serve. Grilled chicken sandwiches and hamburgers, prepare, cook, serve. So you kind of see, you're just kind of following the food along the path that it's made and served. So determine the critical control points. So find the points in the process where identified hazards can be prevented, eliminated, or reduced to safe levels. These are CCPs. Depending on the process, there may be more than one CCP, right? So there can be several. Establish your critical limits. So for each CCP, like for instance, when you cook the chicken, the critical control limit would be 165. The chicken has to get to 165, and that's when we know, that pathogens have been reduced or eliminated. Number 4, establish a monitoring procedures. Determine the best way to check critical limits. So usually it's with a thermometer to make sure that they are consistently met. Identify who will monitor them and how often. That is a very important part, in that you have to identify who is going to do it, because when the job is not assigned to anyone, then you can't guarantee that anyone's going to do it. Principle 5, identify the corrective actions. So in the event that you find that something is not cooked to the correct temperature or something was not maintained at the correct temperature, what will you do? Determine these steps in advance so that everyone knows exactly what to do if it occurs. Verify that the system works. So determine if the plan is working as intended. Evaluate the plan on a regular basis. You can use charts or records or hazard analysis. Determine if your plan prevents, reduces, or eliminates identified hazards. So if your plan is difficult to follow or people don't understand it, it would be worth revisiting it to make sure that you're actually getting the intended result. The last one is going to be Principle 7, establish procedures for record keeping and documentation. So keep records for these actions, monitoring activities. If you had to take corrective action, you would have that in there. Validating your equipment, checking for good working condition, and then working with your suppliers. So that's it for chapters 7 and 8. Go ahead and work on your quizzes, and don't forget about your discussion board.